Hi! February, the month of love. Today I'm going to recommend you some of my personal favorite reads that are sort of inspired by this month. These are my personal opinions. I've selected a few book recommendations that just gives those Valentine's Day vibes. I don't know if you guys would agree with these, but these are my picks. So yeah, also excuse the look. I tried to make myself look like I was crying glitters, but I think I just failed and it just looks like a complete mess. Like me. I don't even think you can see it from this distance, but if you can, that was the situation. So, these are my personal recommendations for the month of February. These are books that I've enjoyed in the past and it just gives me those feels. Not all of them are lovey-dovey. Now, the first book recommendation I have for you is a book that is a fairy tale inspired reimagining story of one of my personal favorites, Beauty and the Beast, a tale as old as time. I mean, a fairy tale that has been overdone, I suppose, in recent years. There are a million trillion Beauty and the Beast retellings, but my personal favorite is one that is a bit more subtle. I don't know how to describe it, but it is Beauty by Robin McKinley. Now, if you've read any of Robin McKinley's other books, you do know what her writing style is like. It's not very grand. It has its own little subtle magical qualities. The stories are a bit more slower paced. There's a lot more build up, and that's no exception with Beauty. So obviously Beauty is a retelling of Beauty and the Beast, but like I said, it's a bit more slower paced. It's a bit more character driven, I suppose. There's a lot more build up, a lot more family dynamics. Almost half of the book is focused on the family and her life before she meets the Beast. I mean, it's been many years since I've read this book, but I do remember it took a long time for the story to reach like the Beast and the castle and all that. It's more understated, it's a bit more subtle in its magic, but there are interesting magical elements woven throughout this story. It's more of a comforting read. It has a sort of old-fashioned charm. It kind of reads as if I'm reading a classic. I just think it's more of a cozy, feel-good read. I would recommend this for you if you don't want to pick up something like grand or epic. You just want something that's a bit more self-contained, but also with Robin McKinley, the writing, it's beautifully written. There's a few interesting magical elements that she did weave in throughout the book. It's been many years since I've read this book. I do want to reread this book. I really do. I do want to see my opinions on it now, because it has been years since I've read it. I should pick this one up for myself. I just thought that this was just sweet and romantic, and it's also really short too. I feel like you'll be able to finish this one pretty quickly. There are a few complaints that this book has a bit of a slower start, but if you are familiar with Robin McKinley, her stories aren't very action-packed. It's not very fast-paced. They are more slower books. If you like that sort of subtle build-up, I reckon this is the perfect read. And also Beauty and the Beast retelling. Need I say more? So the next book I have here for you is a more recent read of mine, but it kind of warmed my soul. You may have seen it in my more recent videos, and that is An Enchantment of Ravens by Margaret Rogerson. This book, again, it's a very short book. It's got a very simple premise. It's light, it's fluffy. I would recommend this for you if you just don't want anything too dense. It's just beautiful. I feel like Margaret Rogerson has a beautiful way of writing the world, just the environment. You really get swept away in her lyrical prose. The writing's beautiful. I feel like the setting is beautiful too. You're basically following this painter and she lives in a world where there are Fae, these fairy-like creatures live in this world, these magical beings. The only thing about the Fae is that they can't create anything, so any sort of craftsmanship is all up to the humans to make for the Fae. Human craft is sort of treated like a commodity. The Fae will give magical gifts in exchange for certain crafts, like the main character, who is a painter. She's extremely talented with art and painting. One day the autumn Fae prince comes and wants a portrait painted. She paints him the portrait, but she gives him human emotions because she sees sorrow in his eyes or whatever, and she paints it, and this kind of creates this problem in his court because by God they're not allowed to have human emotions. And so the main character is swept up into this fairy kingdom, sort of mini adventure to kind of solve this issue. Like I said, light and fluffy, there's no density to the story. It's pretty surface level. It doesn't go in depth into like the different kingdoms. So as much as I wanted more details about the world, it doesn't really go into it. The romance aspect is sort of insta-lovey, but I kind of liked it. You know, sometimes I feel like that insta-love trope is just so overdone, so boring and just cringe, but for some reason when I read this one I was really into it, maybe because the whole whimsical vibe of this world, it kind of suited that sort of love story, I suppose. It was very cute, very adorable. I did appreciate sort of the magical elements that were woven into this story as well. I did like how the Fae were more creatures of the earth. As much as they sort of glamorize themselves, there is this sort of primal earthly creature underneath the facade. Highly recommend it for those of you who want something quick, light and fluffy. It kind of has that sort of fairy tale, folklore sort of vibes, whimsical, fantasy. Loved it. So moving away from the cute and fluff, the next book I've got here for you is something that's just dark. It is a darker read. You just need to be prepared, because I wasn't prepared for this story when I read it, and that is The Storyteller by Antonia Michaelis. This is by a German author. It's translated fiction, but honestly speaking, even though it was translated, I feel like the writing, it's stunning. I think more than anything, the reason why I wanted to choose this book, because it has some pretty horrific dark contents in it. It is sort of magical realism, but I think the writing is very romantic. Now, there are trigger warnings if you want to go into this. There is abuse, there's violence, there's rape, suicide. It gets pretty dark, but there is this beautiful otherworldly element to it. It follows the two characters of Anna and Abel. It's got that good girl, bad boy trope. Another trope, overdone, but for some reason this book, it broke me. I was not prepared for the intensity of the story. It's also a book that I think I cried in. I actually cried. I don't cry in a lot of books. It needs to really shock me and rip my soul out. I think there's only like 2 other books that I actually cried in. One being The Kite Runner and the other being A Monster Calls. But yeah, listen, it's been a few years since I've read this book, but the impact it had on me, it still remains till this day. I feel like not enough people know about this book. I did go onto Goodreads. I kind of looked through like the opinions people had on this book, and I realized, again, that this book is very hit or miss. There's like people that loved this book and people that absolutely hated this book. But I'm in the love category. You follow Anna and Abel. Anna is from a position of privilege and Abel is this mysterious bad boy in a school. My memory card got full, so it took me a minute. But yeah, where was I with Storyteller? Oh yeah, Abel is that mysterious bad boy. He's from a troubled past with a self-destructive personality. I believe he's an orphan. Him and his little sister are orphans, I think, or they were abandoned or something. I don't know. There is this sort of sad upbringing. He does have a soft spot for his younger sister. This is where the magical realism kind of comes to fruition, is through these fairy tale stories he tells to his younger sister. And one day Anna sort of overhears him having this conversation with his little sister, and she's inexplicably drawn to Abel. There are parts that are extremely problematic in the story, but I feel like it's sort of a reflection upon the dark and brutal reality for these characters, and both of them not the most likable, but for me, I highly enjoyed it. It was sad, it was tragic. There are definitely darker themes throughout this book. It's more like a contemporary book interwoven with magical realism. Highly recommend. The next book I have to recommend you is The Night Circus by Erin Morgenstern, and this book, need I say more? I feel like this book has already been talked about like numerous times by a lot of different YouTubers, so I don't really need to say more. This book, it's a mood, like it's atmospheric. The way Erin Morgenstern writes is just so beautiful. I feel like this is a theme for all the books that I have mentioned so far. All the books that I've mentioned have very beautiful lyrical writing, and this is no exception. I feel like Erin Morgenstern is a master of atmosphere. You feel immersed in this world. You taste the things she talks about. Again, a more slower paced novel. It spans through decades in time. It follows this magical, mysterious circus. Is there one day, gone the next, and it kind of travels throughout the world, mainly around Europe. It follows an ensemble cast of characters. The main focus is on two magicians that are a part of the Night Circus, and it's sort of like this competition between the two magicians and how they outdo each other. There is this magical element interwoven into the story. It is sort of a life and death situation. These magicians have these mentors that are teaching them. The people in the circus are like family. It just has a very wonderful, mysterious but cozy vibe. Can't explain it. It is a slower read, and it did take me a while to finish the book, but well worth it. I feel like every little detail, every part, every character you follow plays a vital part in the story. That being said, I would recommend this as a February read because you have these two magicians, they're competing against each other, but then there is this sort of romantic element between the two as well. It's sort of like a forbidden romance situation. I feel like the circus itself is a character. It does have sort of that magical, fantastical, whimsical element to it. It also has this dark element because people are manipulating the situation. You know what it kind of reminds me of? It kind of reminds me of a literary fiction with fantasy elements. I feel like I don't need to elaborate too much on the Night Circus, and if you haven't read it, I would highly recommend it. In fact, my friend who doesn't even read, I mean, I'm sure she reads a little here and there, but even she has read this book, and like, she's not much of a reader. I feel like it can cater to a lot of different people. It's sort of set in our world, and the fantasy sort of magical elements are like sort of barely in it, but it kind of feels more fantasy because of how atmospheric and otherworldly this circus feels. Perfect, beautiful, romantic, love it. Where there is love, there is poetry. Am I right? Next book I have for you is a poetry collection. It is Love and Misadventure by Leav. Leav? I feel like I'm saying her name wrong. If you've noticed on this channel, I'm not very good at pronouncing author names. I think it's Leav, whatever. Honestly speaking, I have not had a good streak with poetry. I think I own like, I don't know, like 3 or 4 other poetry collections, and they've all been mediocre, but I feel like Leav is probably my favorite poet that I've read, and so I would recommend this. And also it has love in the title. There's a sort of whimsy to her poetry. For the most part, I enjoyed it. I feel like poetry is a hard area for me, but if you want something just sort of simple, this is the poetry for you. I'm not an expert in poetry. I don't read many poetry, so who am I to decide? But out of all the collections I've read so far, I think this is probably my favorite. I actually own Lullabies by her, but I don't think I've read Lullabies. I should give that a go. That's it for poetry. I feel like for poetry I don't really have much to say. If you read poetry, what do you recommend? Because I honestly, I don't know where to start. I sort of just read poetry collections that were sort of trending because I wanted to get into poetry, but I don't really know which ones are that great. But I did want to include a poetry collection in this recommendation, so there's that. The lucky last book I have here for you is No and Me, and this is not so much a romantic read, it's more like a feel-good read. It is by Delphine de Vigan. This is a French author, so it's also another translated fiction. It follows this girl by the name of Leav, and there are like sad undertones of what her family is going through, and there's this sort of disconnect that she has. And so you follow this character, I think this is set in Paris, and she just goes around to people watch, and she's, I think, doing this for some project at school, but she ends up befriending a homeless girl who's of a similar age to her, and there's this friendship that blossoms between the two, and I just remember it being cute, warm, loving, and you just feel good after reading it. It's been a hot minute since I've read this. Actually, it's been like many years, and I've forgotten a lot about the storyline itself. I just remember the relationship between this homeless girl and Leav. The homeless girl's name is No, hence why the title is No and Me. It's just beautiful. It's just quirky, and I loved it. And it's one of the books I wanted to recommend because you know what, sometimes you don't want to read anything with romance in it. In fact, I feel like a book that depicts a good relationship between friends and unlikely friends at that, I feel like that is something that is so rare to find. The main focus is on the friendship aspect, and it was just a wonderful, delightful read, and I would highly recommend this book. This one is more character driven. It's a cute read. I also feel like this book no one really knows about in the booktube community, so I feel like this is one that I should kind of push at you guys a bit. And it's also one that I should read again. This one's due for a reread. It's also another short book that you can just fly through, and so I would recommend this book. Anyway, that is it. Those are my February recommendations. If there are books here that you've loved and enjoyed, tell me in the comments below. And if you have any recommendations, write them in the comments below as well. I would like to see what you guys would recommend for like a Valentine's read. I know the Valentine's Day spirit is sort of cringy and you kind of want to gouge out your eyes sometimes, especially for those of us who are forever alone like me. But there is something about Valentine's Day that I still love. I love the aesthetic. A lot of things that come out around Valentine's Day is just very cute and pretty. It's a theme that I sort of like, even though totally can't relate. What is love? That is why I have fiction to read and indulge myself in. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed. I hope you have a lovely day. Until next time, see you later.